Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
When you hear the name Terry Fox, you think courage, determination, hope. Those are just a few of the words to describe his legacy that has been taught in Canadian classrooms and households for years. After losing his leg to osteogenic sarcoma at just 18 years old, Terry ran across Canada, raising money for cancer research in a marathon of hope in 1980. To date, over $900 million has been raised in Terry's name through the annual Terry Fox Run, which is held across the nation and right around the world. While Terry Fox is a household name, what about George Hincks and Marshall McDougall? Do these names ring a bell? Well, before Terry Fox, these two war amputees hiked across the country for disability justice, and today we learn about their journey. I'm Melanie Ng, and in this episode of The Big Story, we're speaking with Eric Story, adjunct professor at Wilfrid Laurier University and a postdoctoral fellow at Western University. He is the author of a recently published article in the Calgary Herald that dives into the remarkable story of Hincks and McDougall and their brave mission. Eric, thank you so much for joining.
Melanie, thanks for having me.
So let's go deep into the history books. I did just a quick Google search. If anyone looked for those two names that I mentioned, they might not find a whole lot. And that is where you come in. So let's go backward as to why you wanted to do this deep dive.
I hadn't heard of these two individuals either, Melanie, when I first started this project looking at the legacies of the First World War in Canada. And it was really just me stumbling upon them in an old veterans publication called The Veteran in 1923. And they made very quick note of two men who decided to hike across Canada or attempt to hike across Canada for disability rights justice. And that got me wondering, had someone written about these fellows before? Has anyone heard of them? And as you did, I did a dive and they weren't there. And so I tracked them down in the newspapers and I followed their story across Canada.
And it's a pretty remarkable story. So let's go back, as you said, to the First World War, both losing a leg, and they met up in a treatment hospital in Calgary, and that's where things really, truly began. Can we pick things up from there?
Yeah, for sure. So they didn't know each other before then, but they were both members of the Amputations Association of the Great War, which we know today as the War Amps. And though they had never encountered one another, they did once they reached this Calgary Military Hospital. And another patient decided to make a wager to the entire patient ward. And he said that he bet no veteran who was missing a leg could hike across Canada from Calgary to Ottawa without a ride, with just simply on crutches. And George Hincks and Marshall McDougall, they decided to take that wager. And from there, they took their trek across Canada beginning in April 1923.
This is quite the journey. We're talking thousands of kilometers. And as noted, this is on crutches. There were also other limitations where they had to be out of pocket, right? Like they couldn't, they had to fund this themselves. They couldn't get a ride from anybody. So this is quite the journey. And so for these two individuals who didn't know one another to take on that challenge and say, yeah, we're going to do it. Clearly there was something within them that you've learned that said, I have to do this. It's not just about that challenge. It's not just about that dare. There's a reason why we want to do this. What was in their heart?
Well, as I said, they were members of the Amputations Association of the Great War. And in the early 1920s, there was a fairly significant economic recession, and people with disabilities at the time were viewed as unproductive. They could not contribute to the economy. And so that meant that during this economic recession, men with disabilities in particular found it extremely difficult to find work. And these were the conditions that men like Marshall McDougall and George Hincks found themselves. George Hincks actually was unemployed once they began their hike. So this was not just a theoretical problem for him. This was a very real problem that he was facing in his life, needing to support his wife and himself. And so that's what really drove them, was this problem of unemployment, but in particular the stigma against people with disabilities. And they sought to raise awareness for people suffering with similar disabilities and Canadian society.
Along their journey, which was grueling, you described it as, one of the hottest days of the year and where they were really struggling throughout their trek. But to make money along the way, I believe one of them played an instrument and one of them used their words as their instrument, their voice as their instrument to spread word about awareness. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Marshall McDougall, he was the piano player of the two. And so he entertained the folks in each town that they stopped in. They stopped in Medicine Hat, they stopped in Regina, Winnipeg. And along the way, Marshall McDougall, he would play piano. But George Hincks, he was the spokesperson. He was the guy among the duo that spoke to communities to raise awareness around disability-related issues in Canadian society. And one of the things that he really wanted folks to know was this problem of visible disability. And he used this hypothetical scenario. Other veterans from the Amputations Association of the Great War used this example as well, is when a veteran with either an amputated leg or an amputated arm walked into a potential employer's office, it was immediately apparent to that employer that they had a missing limb and therefore they were unproductive. And so what George Hincks wanted his audiences to recognize was that those were inherent prejudices built into the system that they had to confront in addition to an economic recession. And so he wasn't just asking for people to hire more veterans with amputations, but to also confront these prejudices that they and other people with disabilities confronted in Canadian society.
I'm wondering if there was any feedback along the journey and in your research, what kind of reception they were getting within some of these communities. Did you come across any of that information?
Well, it was interesting that you asked that question because clearly there was some fraternity amongst veterans with amputations, because along the way, they would have to stay at people's homes, and often they would stay at the homes of other members of the Amputations Association of the Great War. And so clearly there were some bonds that linked these men who suffered from amputations during the Great War. Other than that, there's not a lot of talk of the reception to these men, rather just an acknowledgement and a celebration that they were there as they made their way along their trek.
Sadly, it did not come to completion. Can you talk a little bit near the end and where it got so exhausting for both individuals from a physical standpoint?
It was, the entire journey was grueling and extremely difficult for these two men. I think on their first day, the first few days, they had made their way to Medicine Hat, and they mentioned that their hands were blistered and that, their armpits were rubbed raw from having to use crutches along their walk. But there was actually a point, even before they reached Lake Superior, where their journey did eventually end, where they had to break one of the tenets of the wager, and that was to get a ride when they arrived in Brandon. And that was because they were suffering from some form of paralysis. When there's too much pressure under one's armpit for long periods of time, it can actually lead to limp arms and limp hands. And there was concern that these men were actually going to become paralyzed if they continued to pinch the nerves under their armpits. And eventually they made it as far as the western shores of Lake Superior in what is today Thunder Bay. And they had experienced a number of extremely difficult circumstances. Marshall McDougall quit actually even before they reached Thunder Bay. But George Hincks, he didn't want to give up. He pushed as far and as hard as he could. But once he reached Thunder Bay, he realized that he was not going to be able to make it to Ottawa after all, and decided to call it quits right there.
Is that where the history book ends for their journey? Did you hear, I'm wondering if any of your research, if there was any contact with family members to this day who might be continuing this journey, or at least spreading the word of where they began that journey. And because this fight, this stigma that you speak of, when you talk about decades ago that this happened, it still exists today. And so I'm wondering if you've had any connection to family members or associations who've been telling this story.
Yeah, it's a great question, Melanie, and the fight does continue on. We often locate disability rights activism in the post-Second World War period after 1945, but it was actually men like George Hincks and Marshall McDougall and those who were members of the Amputations Association of the Great War that really did kick off the modern disability rights movement in Canada. And there's a through line directly from them to the present day. And obviously, disability rights has expanded enormously from that time to include, people that are experiencing mental health issues, developmental disabilities, and other forms of disabilities. But to bring it back in time, it's really through the men like George Hincks and Marshall McDougall that we can see the birth of the disability rights movement in Canada.
Your article, when our listeners hear this episode, it will be out in the Calgary Herald. I am curious if you're going to get some feedback from people who want to contact you and want to share information with you about their history. Have you ever put anything out there? You've been in this for some time, who've come to you and said, hey, I want to share more with you, something that you're not going to find in the microfiche, you're not going to find in those archives, because hearing those personal stories, that really makes a difference. Have you ever got that before?
I certainly have, and it's one of the most rewarding parts of doing historical research. I was just saying to my wife just last night how rewarding it is when history meets the present, and when you can kind of really see a direct link from a history all the way up to the present. And so whenever I get folks reaching out to me, whether it's at speaking engagements or they engage with my work, my written work, it's always just such a pleasure when I can make that direct link between the history and the present. So hopefully some folks do reach out to me after hearing this or reading the article in the Herald tomorrow.
When people hear the name Terry Fox, of course, there's that association. Is your hope that the names George Hincks and Marshall McDougall stand out like that?
I certainly do. I think they are two wonderful historical characters that have been forgotten for one reason or another. But I think their story is a strong testament to not just people with disabilities, but also Canadians. I think it's an important Canadian story to be told. And so I hope that people think of George Hincks and Marshall McDougall when they also think of Terry Fox.
Eric Story, appreciate you sharing this story. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Melanie. It was a lot of fun.
And that was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all of your favorite podcast players. Don't forget to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Melanie Ng. Thank you so much for listening.